The wedding night left traces behind, faint laughter soaked into the rugs, the sweet rot of roses curling in the air, someone's forgotten shawl draped over the banister like a ghost. Everyone had gone to bed, or pretended to. I sat on the porch alone, shawl wrapped tight, feet tucked beneath me like I used to sit when I was younger. The stars blinked without urgency. My tea had gone lukewarm, but I held the cup anyway, more for comfort than heat. Then she came. Brittany, my son's new wife, barefoot on the porch steps, delicate as a painting, carrying a china teacup I hadn't seen since last Christmas. She smiled with all her teeth. Said she couldn't sleep. Wanted to talk. Said I seemed so wise. But her eyes, they never stayed with mine. They wandered, flicked to the hallway behind me. Rested a moment too long in the direction of my bedroom door. I smiled. Said nothing. Let the night stretch thin between us. Nothing happened, not really. No shouting. No sneaking. No scene. But something turned in me. Something quiet. Cold. Like a knob clicking shut. I want to hear your thoughts before I continue. Would you like any changes? The morning after the wedding, I woke at 5. Not out of worry. Not even out of habit anymore. It's just the way time moves when you live alone, slow and steady, like an old clock that doesn't chime unless you wind it. I stood in the kitchen barefoot, the tiles cool against my feet, and filled the kettle. The familiar hiss of the gas flame was oddly comforting. I'd lived in this house for over 30 years. I knew every noise it made, the soft gurgle of the radiator, the way the refrigerator sighed when the door wasn't fully closed, the faint creak of the floorboard outside the laundry room. It had always been that way, small sounds that made up the rhythm of my days. Outside, the sky was still that pale blue color before the sun commits to rising. The garden looked damp. The petals from yesterday's wedding bouquet were already beginning to curl at the edges. Someone had stepped on a few. Pink against the brick like bruises. I carried my coffee to the dining table and sat. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. I thought about the night before. About the way Brittany had stood beside me on the porch, talking softly, smiling as though she meant it. She said she wanted to know me better. That it was important to her to be close now that we were family. Her words were fine. Polished. But her eyes gave her away. They drifted too much, toward the hallway, toward the stairs, toward the back of the house. She knew something was back there. Or she thought she did. That hallway leads to my bedroom, and inside, hidden behind an old bookshelf, is a safe my husband installed himself, long before Thomas ever left for college. He didn't trust banks, not fully. Some things should be kept close, he'd said. Not because we had money, but because we had memory. Documents, yes. But also pieces of our life together. His father's watch. A silver locket from my grandmother. Love letters, the real kind, written on paper that had grown soft and almost see-through with age. Photographs never scanned, never posted. The kind you keep for yourself. I never thought much about that safe. Not until Brittany showed up with her interest in family planning and questions about wills, about assets, about how I managed things living alone. It's not that the questions were wrong. But she asked them like someone preparing for something. She'd only been married into this family for less than a day, and already she spoke like the next matriarch. That morning, she came down the stairs already dressed. Her hair done. Earrings in. A neat, pale cardigan, tasteful, just expensive enough. Thomas trailed behind her, half awake and still smelling like hotel soap. She kissed his cheek, told him she'd start the coffee. Then she turned to me, smiling. I was just telling Thomas, she said, this house has such a strong presence. It's beautiful, really. But it must feel a little big now, with you on your own. I nodded. I manage just fine. She gave a small laugh. Of course you do. I just mean, it's a lot to keep up. My mother had to downsize after my dad passed, and it made everything so much easier. She said it like a suggestion, but her tone said something else. It said she had been thinking about this. About where I belonged now. About how the pieces might shift. Thomas didn't notice. He sat at the table scrolling through something on his phone. Oblivious, as sons often are when their wives begin to reshape the world around them. After breakfast, she offered to help clean up, but her help came with long pauses near the framed photographs in the hallway. The ones from Thomas's childhood. The living room wall where I'd hung the quilt my sister made us when we married. Her fingers grazed surfaces like she was taking inventory. And again, she paused in front of the shelf. The one that hides the safe. Just a glance, no more than a second. But I saw the calculation behind it. A flicker of thought. A plan forming. I stayed silent. Later, while they went for a walk, or maybe just left to give her time to speak more freely, I walked back into the bedroom and locked the door. Something I hadn't done in years. I moved the shelf carefully. Slid the panel aside. Entered the combination by feel. My fingers remembered it even if my mind didn't summon it at first. It opened with the same soft click it always had. That smell came with it too, old paper, metal, a faint trace of cedar from the lining. Everything was there. Untouched. The envelope with our marriage certificate. A photo of Thomas as a baby, wrapped in a towel after his first bath. A small ring box with a loose stone, the one we never could afford to reset after it fell out. A letter from my husband I hadn't read since the year he died. Folded into neat thirds, his name still written in that shaky last-year handwriting. Nothing of value to someone like Brittany. Everything of value to me. I didn't move anything. Just looked. Closed it again. Reset the dial. Covered it with the books. Then I stood for a long while, not moving, not thinking, just knowing. That night, after they came back and went upstairs, talking in low voices, giggling like children, I sat alone in the den with a second cup of coffee I didn't really want. The clock chimed softly. The floor upstairs creaked once. Then again. I knew what was coming. Maybe not that night. Maybe not even this week. But I had seen enough people try to edge their way into lives they didn't build. I taught school for 27 years. You learn to spot manipulation early when you've been in a room full of teenagers day after day. The smiles that don't match the eyes. The questions that lead somewhere different than they appear to. People think aging dulls your instincts. But what it really does is sharpen them. You lose the desire to pretend you didn't notice. And I had noticed. That night, before I went to bed, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out an old notebook from the drawer by the bed and began to write. Not a diary. Just notes. Observations. What she looked at. What she asked. What time they left. What time they returned. Where her eyes landed when she thought no one was watching. Not because I was afraid. Because I was preparing. It started with little things. Small details, easy to brush aside at first. Brittany asking whether I had security cameras in the house. A harmless enough question, but asked with a little too much casual interest, and at an odd moment, we were in the middle of drying dishes. Then, a day later, she asked how long I planned to keep living here alone. It wasn't an accusation, not even really a suggestion, but it carried that quiet implication: your time in this house may be running out. She couched everything in charm. She had a way of speaking that made her seem polite even when the questions were far too personal. The kind of person who touches your arm when they talk to you, not for comfort, but to control where your attention goes. Thomas didn't notice. He never has. His heart is in the right place, but his mind drifts. He's used to women like Brittany guiding the conversation, and over time, I think he forgot what it sounds like when someone is speaking with no agenda. I watched quietly. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I told myself maybe she was just adjusting to marriage, trying to find her place in the family. But the pattern grew clearer with each passing day. She would wander through rooms when she thought I wasn't looking. Once, I found her in the hallway closet. She smiled and said she was looking for a scarf she thought she left there. But she hadn't worn a scarf the entire week. Another time, I came in from the garden and caught the tail end of her walking out of my study. She claimed she was just admiring the old oak desk, the one with the locked drawer that contains my documents. She had no reason to be in there. She was polite. Always smiling. But that smile didn't reach her eyes when she looked at me. It stayed still and measured, like something she practiced in a mirror. And the more I observed her, the more it became clear, she wasn't here as a guest anymore. She was surveying. Measuring. Testing. I didn't say anything to Thomas. It wouldn't have done any good. He's not a fool, but like many men, he's never been particularly good at hearing the music behind the words. He takes things at face value, always has. When she made offhand remarks about estate planning or financial responsibility, he just nodded along. But I heard the edge in her voice. I caught the pauses. I recognized the way she was preparing a story, one in which I wasn't the main character anymore. She asked how I paid my bills. Asked if I had ever considered consolidating accounts, just in case. Asked, too casually, what kind of insurance coverage I had and whether I had a will in place. Always with that same tone, warm, friendly, like she was just looking out for me. But the questions were too specific. Too rehearsed. And then there was the matter of the bookshelf. The safe is behind a shelf in my bedroom. It's not hidden by a false wall or anything clever. It's just tucked behind a row of old cookbooks and gardening manuals. My husband built it into the plaster when we first moved in, and for decades it's held a few important things: letters, some jewelry that's only valuable to me, a few documents, and one or two items that belong to my parents. Nothing flashy. No large sums of money. Nothing you'd find in a movie. Still, it's not something most people know about. I never told Brittany. I'm sure Thomas knew it existed when he was young, but I doubt he ever cared enough to remember. Yet twice that week I caught Brittany glancing at that shelf. Not long, just a few seconds too many. Once, she even ran her hand across the spines of the books. She didn't know I was watching from the hallway mirror. It didn't take long for instinct to become certainty. That night, after they had gone out for dinner with friends, I opened the safe. Everything was still there, but I didn't like how the dial felt in my hand. It wasn't where I had left it. I always turn it back to 0 when I close it, a habit my husband taught me. It was 2 ticks off. That's when I knew for sure. The next morning, she had a rash on both hands. Not severe, but visible. Red, irritated. She said it must have been something she touched at the restaurant, a cloth napkin or a cleaning product, maybe. But I didn't believe her. I didn't say anything. I just offered her a cold compress. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, was that I'd lined the dial of the safe the night before with a harmless skin irritant mixed into a thin coat of mineral oil. A trick I'd learned years ago when I taught science enrichment programs at the local high school. It doesn't do any lasting harm, but it's enough to let you know who's been touching what. The safe had nothing in it by then, at least, nothing of consequence. I had moved the meaningful items elsewhere, to a small cedar box in the attic, inside a trunk she would never think to open. In their place, I had left props. A file labeled "Account Closures" filled with old bank brochures. A stack of fake bills I'd printed from an online template years ago as part of a prank gift. And a note, typed, not handwritten, "This is not what you think it is." I left the door unlatched. Not wide open, just enough to appear forgotten. 2 days later, they cut their visit short. Thomas told me Brittany had been feeling under the weather. They had planned to stay through the weekend, but she was eager to get home. I offered to pack them a small basket for the road, but Brittany declined. She barely looked at me during their last breakfast. Her eyes were tired, and her smile was gone. Thomas tried to make small talk, but it didn't carry. They left after lunch. No hugs, no lingering goodbyes. Just a quick wave from the driveway and the sound of tires rolling over gravel. 3 evenings later, Thomas called. His voice was quieter than usual. He told me Brittany had gone back to her parents' house for a while. Said she needed space. He didn't explain much beyond that. She left a note, he added. It said, "Your mother knows. I'm sorry." He didn't ask what it meant. I told him to take care of himself and left it at that. After we hung up, I washed the dishes for my solitary dinner and stood by the window. The garden was beginning to dry out, too many hot days without rain. But the house was quiet again, and the air felt still in a way I hadn't realized I missed. I didn't feel victorious. This wasn't a triumph. But I felt settled. I had trusted my instincts. I hadn't been caught off guard. And I had not been taken for a fool. That, to me, was enough. After they left, the house fell back into its usual rhythm, but the air felt different. I've always lived with quiet, especially since my husband passed, but this quiet had a shape to it. It wasn't the peaceful kind that settles into the walls after company leaves. It was the kind that lingers when something has been disturbed and isn't quite finished. I spent that first evening doing what I always do, wiping down the counters, checking the locks, laying out my clothes for morning. These tasks never change. They ground me. But that night, I moved a little slower. I stopped halfway through folding a dish towel and stood there, just holding it. My thoughts weren't racing, exactly, they were organizing. Categorizing. There's a kind of calm that comes when you've seen something clearly and finally know what to do about it. Brittany hadn't come here to build a family. She came here to build a story. One where I was the fading woman in the background, someone whose house would soon become someone else's, whose decisions didn't matter anymore. She had a plan, I saw that now. And she'd probably had it long before the wedding. I thought about all the things she said during those days, the hints about insurance, the questions about how I managed the property, the way she touched the banister with familiarity as if measuring where her things would go. She never said a cruel word, but sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who speak gently while reaching for what isn't theirs. I didn't need her to admit anything. I didn't even need Thomas to understand the full truth. What I needed was to take back control, quietly, cleanly, without a fight. There was no dignity in dramatics. There was dignity in clarity. So I began planning. Not for revenge, not even for confrontation. I didn't want a scene. I wanted her to see herself plainly. To feel that moment of recognition when you realize someone was always 10 steps ahead, and let you walk into it anyway. I started by opening the safe again. I emptied it fully. I took out the old watch, the locket, the letters, the ring, the deeds, and folded them carefully into a linen pouch. I sealed it, wrapped it twice, and placed it at the back of my linen closet in a hollow compartment I'd used years ago for holiday money and gifts. No one would find it there. Then I returned to the safe and filled it with substitutions, not garbage, not nonsense, but enough to create confusion. I printed a dozen fake documents using real letterheads from old bank accounts I'd closed years ago. I typed out phony correspondence between lawyers, scripts from a community play I used to direct, altered just enough to sound believable. I even labeled one folder, Pending Transfers, Estate Holdings. Nothing in it was real. On top, I placed a crisp envelope with a typed label, Private, Family. Inside, I placed a single line typed in bold, "You were looking for something you could never own." Then I left the safe unlocked. Just slightly. Enough that someone curious might think I'd forgotten to shut it fully. I know how that looks to someone who believes they're smarter than you. It's an invitation. I didn't expect her to return soon. But when she did, and I believed she wouldn't be able to resist. In the meantime, I reviewed my legal documents. I met with Mr. Ellis, the attorney who helped me settle my husband's affairs after he passed. He's a calm man, patient, with a tidy office and a good memory. I asked him to go over everything, the deed, the will, my accounts, the transfer on death forms. "I just want to be sure I know exactly where I stand," I said. He gave me a long look but didn't ask questions. "Is someone pressing you to make changes?" "Not directly," I answered. "But it's possible someone's circling." He nodded. "Then it's wise you're checking. People tend to be more subtle than they used to be, but not more honest." He confirmed what I already knew, my accounts were in order. My name was the only one on the deed. The will left everything to Thomas, yes, but only with very clear conditions, that he maintain the home as a residence for me as long as I chose to live here, and that no sale or transfer could occur without my signed approval. I'd insisted on that clause when we updated the documents after my husband's passing. Not because I expected trouble, but because I knew what could happen when people see property as leverage. I asked Mr. Ellis to update a few more things. We filed a letter of intent outlining the most recent events, should anything more serious occur. We also added a clause to my medical power of attorney, limiting outside influence on care decisions unless explicitly authorized. He didn't ask why. Just said, "You're doing this the right way." Quiet, clean, and legal. When I got home that evening, I walked through the house slowly. I dusted the picture frames. I rearranged the dried flowers in the hallway. I lit a small candle in the dining room, not for atmosphere, but for steadiness. There's something about candlelight that reminds you who you are. It doesn't demand attention. It just stays there, steady, even when the rest of the room is dark. I didn't tell anyone what I'd done. I didn't call Thomas. I didn't speak to Brittany. Instead, I prepared. I took the safe's contents and scanned them onto a secure drive. I labeled the drive with a code name only I would recognize. Then I placed it in a safety deposit box under a different bank account I'd kept separate since my husband's passing. Something he'd encouraged me to open, just in case I ever needed privacy or independence. In the days that followed, I continued life as usual. I made soup, mended a hem, visited the library. But all the while, I watched. And waited. Because I knew something else, people like Brittany don't give up that easily. They go quiet when something rattles their plans, but only so they can regroup. She didn't walk away from Thomas, not yet. She just stepped back to reframe the situation. And I had no doubt she would return. Either with a softer tone or a more urgent tactic. But this time, I would be ready. Not just with traps or notes or locks. With proof. With legal clarity. With a house I knew corner to corner, and a memory that hadn't failed me yet. There's something people forget about women like me, women who've lived through illness, debt, caregiving, widowhood. We may look soft. We may move slowly. But we remember. We observe. And most of all, we adapt. This wasn't about outsmarting a thief. It was about reminding myself, and her, that I still owned the keys. Literally and figuratively. And I didn't plan on handing them over. The following week passed with no word from Brittany. No messages, no calls, no unexpected visits. Thomas texted me a few times, short, polite things. "Just checking in, Mom. Need anything from the store?" I responded kindly, but briefly. There was nothing cold in my tone, just calm. He didn't bring her up, and I didn't ask. Still, the silence didn't sit comfortably. I don't like unfinished things. And I knew this wasn't finished. Brittany didn't strike me as the kind of woman who simply gives up. That kind of determination doesn't disappear overnight. It just finds another path. On Thursday morning, I got a call from the bank. Mrs. Garrison, the manager said, we had an unusual attempt on one of your inactive accounts. Nothing was withdrawn, but we flagged the login. It came from an out-of-state IP address, traced to a hotel network. Do you want to activate fraud monitoring? I told him yes, absolutely. And I wrote down every detail he gave me. I only had one account still under my maiden name, a small one, long inactive, with barely any funds. But I had kept it open for a reason. It was something my husband and I set up in the early years of our marriage when we were just starting to save. At the time, we thought we'd use it for travel. Later, we left it open as a kind of backup, a place for family emergency funds. I hadn't touched it in years. But someone else had tried. And only 2 people knew that account existed, me, and Thomas, because I once mentioned it to him while helping him apply for his first home loan. It wasn't the kind of thing he would remember on his own. Someone must have reminded him. Or rather, prompted him. That was my confirmation. This wasn't just about curiosity or vague interest anymore. This was about access. Brittany may have stepped back temporarily, but her intentions hadn't changed. The difference was, neither had mine. I didn't panic. I didn't rush to call Thomas or confront anyone. Instead, I finished making my tea, folded the laundry, and sat at the kitchen table with my notebook. I opened to a clean page and started listing everything I now knew. Not speculation. Not feelings. Just facts. Timestamps, dates, small interactions, comments that hadn't seemed important at the time. I wrote down the IP address the bank had given me. I wrote down the time of the attempt. I even included the rash she developed after touching the safe. Somewhere around the 4th page, I paused and took a breath. Not because I was overwhelmed. Because I finally felt prepared. I thought about the safe, still sitting as I'd left it. Technically locked now, but only holding decoys. The real contents, the only pieces that mattered, were elsewhere. Secured. Protected. I'd taken every precaution, moved documents into a trust under a blind name, updated my medical proxy, limited financial access to a single attorney I'd known for decades. Everything in my life that could be twisted, stolen, or leveraged was now either protected or made deliberately unappealing. That was the trick. Not just to lock things away, but to make them uninteresting. The decoy folder labeled Estate Holdings was full of staged emails between fictional financial planners, all discussing closing accounts due to liquidation for health expenses. The story those papers told was simple: my assets had been spent. There was nothing left to take. Nothing to inherit. Nothing to control. I imagined Brittany reading through it, trying to find the part she'd missed, trying to connect pieces that didn't fit. Maybe she'd show it to someone else, a friend, a lawyer, a relative, hoping they'd spot the value she couldn't. But there would be nothing. No money. No leverage. Just plausible-sounding disappointment. I felt no guilt. What I did was not cruel. It was protective. Necessary. I had seen women like me disappear into the background of their own lives. Good, honest women who raised children, cared for husbands, gave their time, their money, their patience, and ended up being nudged out, patronized, or quietly maneuvered until they were nothing but a burden. A problem to solve. I wasn't going to let that happen. Not in this house. Not while I still had the strength to see clearly. That weekend, Thomas asked if he could stop by. I said yes, and I meant it. I wasn't angry with him. Not really. He wasn't the one I distrusted, not fully. But I needed to see where he stood. He arrived Saturday afternoon, alone. He looked tired, though he tried not to show it. He brought flowers, chrysanthemums, the kind his father always liked, and a small jar of local honey he said he picked up at the farmer's market. I set them in water and thanked him. We sat in the sunroom. I poured tea. We made small talk for a while, the weather, the garden, a book I'd just finished. Then, as the silence stretched, he cleared his throat. "Brittany's staying at her parents' for now," he said, not looking at me. I nodded. He hesitated again. "She said you confronted her." "I didn't," I replied. "I left something for her to find." "She found it." He frowned slightly. "She wouldn't say what it was." "No," I said. "She wouldn't." He looked at me then, really looked. "Is there something I need to know?" I set down my cup. "I think you already know it. You just haven't said it aloud." He didn't answer. But his eyes didn't leave mine. "She was asking about your finances," he said finally. "Your accounts. Your insurance." I told her not to. I told her to leave it alone. But she didn't. "No," he admitted quietly. "She didn't." We sat for a long moment. Then he asked, "Did you ever consider giving her the benefit of the doubt?" "I did," I said. "Until I realized she already had a plan." He didn't argue. "Do you still trust me?" I asked. He nodded. "Yes. I do." I believed him. He didn't stay long. He had errands, he said. I walked him to the door, watched him drive off. He didn't promise to fix anything. He didn't apologize for her. But I didn't need that. I just needed to know he saw the shape of things for what they were. That night, I checked the safe again. Still locked. Still untouched. I smiled to myself and went to bed. The next morning, I pulled out my notebook and wrote a single sentence on the last page. She walked into the trap I built by simply continuing to be myself. Because sometimes, being steady is the sharpest edge you can carry. The following week was quiet again, but not in the way that brings peace. It was the kind of quiet that follows an argument that never happened, words unspoken, but felt. I went about my routines as usual. I swept the porch, clipped dead branches from the hydrangeas, made chicken broth from the last of the freezer stock. But everything felt slightly shifted, like the house itself was waiting to exhale. I hadn't heard from Brittany since she left. Thomas called once, on a Tuesday afternoon. He said he was just checking in, but there was something in his voice, slower than usual, like he was turning something over in his mind while we spoke. He asked how I'd been sleeping. I told him I slept fine. I didn't ask how she was. He didn't offer. I didn't expect her to return to the house. I had made that much clear, even if I never said the words directly. What she did wasn't a simple mistake. It was a choice. A pattern of choices, really, disguised as concern, cloaked in politeness, layered in casual comments and offhand questions. The kind of manipulation that relies on the assumption that the other person is too kind, or too tired, or too trusting to notice what's happening. But I had noticed. And more importantly, I had responded without giving her what she wanted, or what she expected. That's what disturbed her most, I think. Not the fact that I protected myself, but the fact that I did it calmly. Without accusation. Without drama. I didn't play the role she'd written for me. And that meant she had nowhere else to go with her story. The thing about people like Brittany is that they don't operate well in silence. They need reaction. Emotion. Someone to fight with. someone to doubt themselves. But I didn't argue. I didn't even confront her. I simply made the truth visible and let her sit in it. That silence, that refusal to be baited, became louder than anything I could have said. I think Thomas knew it, too. Or he was beginning to. The second time he called, a few days later, he sounded different. She won't talk about it, he said. She won't even explain. Just keep saying it was a misunderstanding. She knows it wasn't, I said. I know, he replied. He sounded tired. She wants to come back, he said after a pause. To the house. She said she wants to apologize. To me? I asked. To both of us, I think. I sat with that for a moment. I'm not angry, I told him. But I'm not open to pretense. If she comes here, it has to be with the understanding that things don't go back to how they were. There's no blank slate. He didn't respond right away. I'll tell her, he said. The next day, I got a text from her. Short. Formal. Mrs. Garrison, I'd like to speak with you, in person, if possible. I understand if you'd prefer not to. I waited a few hours before replying. Then I wrote back. You may come on Sunday at noon. Alone. She arrived precisely on time. Not early, not late. Dressed plainly, a navy cardigan, beige slacks, minimal makeup. She looked tired, though not in the physical sense. It was the look of someone who'd had to accept that their plan hadn't worked and was still deciding how to proceed next. I greeted her at the door and stepped aside. I didn't smile, but I didn't frown either. I simply let her in. We sat in the front room. I didn't offer her tea. I want to apologize, she said. For overstepping. I nodded. You did. She looked down at her hands. I thought. I assumed there were things here that, she stopped. That you were entitled to, I finished for her. She didn't argue. I wasn't trying to hurt you, she said quietly. You didn't hurt me, I replied. You insulted me. She blinked, taken aback. You assumed I was naive, I continued. You thought I wouldn't notice what you were doing. That's not ignorance. That's disrespect. I made a mistake, she said. No, I said, you made a series of decisions. Don't call it a mistake. A mistake is a wrong turn on the road. What you did was deliberate. She was silent for a long time. I'm not here to beg, she finally said. But I do love Thomas. I didn't come into this marriage to cause trouble. But you brought trouble into my home, I said. You treated this house, and everything in it, like a stepping stone. You came in with a plan before you knew the people involved. She looked at me, then. Not with anger, but with something else, a kind of startled recognition. You're not what I expected, she said. No, I said. And that's the root of your miscalculation. We sat for another moment. She reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope. I brought back the copies, she said. The ones from the safe. I never showed them to anyone. I wasn't sure what I was looking at, in the end. I took the envelope but didn't open it. She stood. I won't come back here again without your invitation, she said. I mean that. I walked her to the door. As she stepped outside, she turned and said, Thank you for not humiliating me. That was your own doing, I replied. All I did was leave the light on. After she left, I opened the envelope. Everything was intact, the fake documents, the staged letters, even the line I'd written about ownership. She hadn't added anything. She hadn't marked anything. Just placed them back exactly as she'd found them. That night, I called Thomas. She came, I said. I know, he replied. She told me. And? She told me everything. There was a pause. I don't know if I can stay married to someone who does things like that, he said. But I need time to decide. Take it, I said. You don't owe me a resolution. But I do, he said. Because you raised me better than this. That stayed with me. Not the apology, the recognition. In the weeks that followed, I continued on. I moved the real contents of the safe to a fireproof lockbox in the basement. Not because I needed to hide them, but because I wanted them out of sight. The safe itself, I left empty. I never opened it again. The balance in the house shifted. It wasn't about who lived here or who came to visit. It was about the return of something essential, my ownership of space, of memory, of presence. People like Brittany expect women like me to fade politely into the background. To offer tea and smiles and access. They don't expect resistance that looks like patience. They don't understand how quietly power can be held, or how clearly it can be reclaimed. And I didn't do it with anger. I did it with awareness. That's how you defend a life you've built, not by fighting every threat, but by recognizing which ones deserve your energy and which ones can be outlasted with a steady hand. I never saw Brittany again after that. But I didn't need to. She knew. And Thomas knew. And for the first time in years, I felt like myself again. It's been almost 6 months since Brittany stood in my entryway and told me she wouldn't return without an invitation. True to her word, she hasn't. Not for holidays, not for birthdays, not even for Thomas's most recent promotion dinner, which I hosted with quiet formality. She sent a card, unsigned. Nothing more. I didn't ask for updates. I didn't prod Thomas about their marriage. If he wanted to share, he would. Some things can't be forced out of someone before they're ready to speak them aloud. I've learned that lesson too many times to forget it now. He's come by more often, though. Not just out of obligation. He helps in the garden, mends the fence, lingers in the kitchen longer than he used to. Sometimes he brings groceries, small things I don't need, oranges, a jar of fig jam, a magazine I used to subscribe to 10 years ago. I don't comment. I just thank him and set them in their place. Once, as we were trimming back the rose bushes, he paused and asked, "Were you ever scared?" "Of her?" I said. He nodded. "No," I answered. "But I was disappointed." He didn't reply. Just cut another stem. That was all that needed to be said. Somewhere along the way, the tension faded. Not because everything had healed, but because we'd stopped pretending it hadn't happened. That's what made the difference. We weren't erasing anything. We were simply moving forward, with the knowledge that what had once been unspoken was now understood. I still keep the lockbox in the basement. I check it once a month, not out of fear, but out of ritual. The letters are all there. The watch. The brooch. Even the envelope with my husband's handwriting, still folded the way he always did, with sharp corners and a tucked flap. His words don't change, of course. But somehow, reading them now gives me a steadier kind of comfort than they did in the early days after his passing. The safe in the wall remains empty. I haven't removed it, but I also haven't used it since. It's just a hollow shape now, a reminder, not a container. I suppose that's fitting. Some things stay to mark what we've protected, not because they're useful anymore, but because they meant something once. I let it stay for that reason. I kept the notebook too. The one I began during those days when my instincts started speaking louder than my doubts. It's tucked into the drawer by my bed. I don't add to it anymore, but I haven't thrown it away. It's proof, in a way, not just of what happened, but of how I responded. People imagine strength looks like yelling or slamming doors or calling lawyers. And sometimes it does. But often, real strength is quieter. It's restraint. It's planning. It's letting someone show themselves fully, even when every part of you wants to stop them before they do damage. Because once the truth is visible, it doesn't need defending. It stands on its own. I've learned that clarity doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from observation. From knowing who you are, and refusing to let anyone else define it for you. I never told many people what happened. Not friends, not neighbors, not even my sister. I didn't need to. There's a dignity in silence when it's chosen. This wasn't shame. It was discretion. Some stories are more powerful when they're not dissected by outsiders. But I did make one change. I rewrote my will. Not out of anger. Not to punish. But to reflect what I'd learned. I added a letter to be opened upon my death, to accompany the documents. In it, I wrote plainly, about the home, the years I spent tending to it, the memories it held. I explained why it mattered, and what it meant. And then, I laid out my wishes, that if the house is to stay in the family, it must be lived in, not sold, not leveraged, not divided. It must be cared for. The way I cared for it. Thomas is still the beneficiary. I haven't changed that. But I added one more layer. If he chooses not to live here himself, the home will be left to a local women's shelter, to be used as transitional housing for mothers and children rebuilding their lives. It felt right. Not because I wanted to make a point, but because I wanted to make a promise. That this home, which held so much quiet love and work and memory, would never be reduced to a bargaining chip. That it would continue to be a place of restoration, not possession. Thomas hasn't seen the letter yet. He will, one day. And when he does, I think he'll understand. I think he already does. The garden is blooming again now. The hydrangeas came in fuller this year, and the lilacs along the fence have spread farther than I expected. I spend my mornings out there with a cup of tea, pulling weeds, checking for beetles. It's the kind of work that keeps your hands busy and your mind steady. I find it comforting. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the early evening and watch the street. It's a quiet neighborhood. Not much changes. But I like that. There's a rhythm to stillness if you let yourself hear it. The wind chimes my husband hung 30 years ago still play when the breeze is right. The same notes, over and over. I used to find them sentimental. Now I find them reassuring. I don't think about Brittany much anymore. But when I do, I don't feel anger. I feel gratitude, not for her actions, but for the way they reminded me of my own strength. For the clarity they forced me to claim. For the way they returned me to myself. This house, this life, is still mine. Not because I defended it with fists or threats. But because I refused to hand it over quietly. Because I stayed alert. Because I stayed present. Because I knew, in the end, that peace isn't something you're given. It's something you preserve. And I have.